Wel, bore da neu pnawn da I bawb a croeso cynnes I seminar arall yn amser cino WISERD. I don't know whether it's good morning or good afternoon. I never know. It's but very warm welcome to everyone for another WISERD lunchtime seminar. As many of you know, household incomes in Wales do not compare very well with the rest of the UK. And we do know that the impact of COVID on key workers and workers in shutdown sectors has been particularly bad and has eroded what little savings those households had. And there are major concerns in Wales about the impact of COVID on poorer households with children. So with that in mind, I'm really pleased that our speakers joined us here today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Rachel Statham from IPPR Scotland. And Rachel is going to talk to us about the impact of COVID-19 on financial security in Scotland. So over to you, Rachel.
Super, thanks very much. I'll just try and share my screen now. Can you see that okay?
Yes, I can see it fine.
Perfect. Prynhawn da. I'm Rachel Statham. I'm a senior research fellow at IPPR, the Institute for Public Policy Research in Scotland. I'm not a Welsh speaker, unfortunately, but I am married to one, so I know a little bit enough to say hello, at least. And thanks very much for having me here today. Really pleased to be joining. So just to start us off, I'll tell you a little bit about who we are as IPPR. So we're the Institute for Public Policy Research, and we're a progressive think tank that operates across the UK. So I'm based in IPPR Scotland, which is largely involved in kind of gathering evidence about policy impact across Scotland and influencing the Scottish Government particularly. So we're particularly concerned with public policy solutions across the kind of full range of social and economic policy. And we're particularly interested in kind of the angles of economic growth and social justice. And we're kind of 5 years old in Scotland and about 40 years old across the UK. And we work cross-party and we're neutral on the Constitution. So a different sort of research organisation as compared to an academic context, but probably quite a lot of similarities in terms of our interests and hopefully some overlap today. So this piece of research is part of a 2-year project that's funded by the Standard Life Foundation, who are primarily interested in improving living standards across the UK. And it has a dual focus on research and policy impact. So it'll run for 2 years, but it's looking at influencing the Holyrood elections, particularly in 2021, which is obviously coming quite fast around the corner now. And we're interested in developing ideas that can boost financial security and tackle insecurity where we identify it. But we're interested in kind of looking a bit further up the income spectrum than just the population below the poverty line, particularly because, as we'll discuss, there's insecurity kind of further across the income spectrum in Scotland. And in terms of where we are now with the research, we've just published our first report in October, which is looking at the kind of next 6 months, that horizon up until the May 2021 elections, which obviously will be familiar to those of you in Wales, and looking at the kind of immediate challenges from the COVID pandemic and the immediate policy action we think is required to meet those challenges before the next government comes in May time. And I should mention before I start that my co-authors are Henry Parkes and Russell Gunson, who are also based at IPPR. So why are we interested in financial security or financial insecurity? So particularly because in Scotland, as in Wales, to a similar extent, there's been new powers over tax and benefits in particular. And the Scottish Parliament has been increasingly interested and has an increasingly important role in securing financial well-being across Scotland. So in Scotland, much of the debate has been concentrated around child poverty in particular. So we've got statutory binding child poverty targets set against for 2030. There are obviously going to be an increased challenge in meeting those targets in this new context we're operating in. But we've also seen considerable devolution of powers to the new social security agency in Scotland, which means there's quite a lot more opportunity in terms of what policy levers are available. We've particularly seen that realised in the Scottish Child Payment, which is coming as the kind of first major devolved benefit that's kind of originated in Scotland, that's coming into force from March of next year. So applications are now open for low-income families across Scotland. And this project's aiming to kind of build from that base to broaden the debate and create space to develop more radical ideas, kind of bolder policy solutions that can see us through not just this crisis, but through the next parliamentary term in Scotland and beyond that as well. And there's a bit of a question mark around what those elections in 2021 will look like. Although now I think we're in a context where we know that at least we'll be going ahead. Fingers crossed. So we started by looking at principles of financial security. And what we think that needs to look like for financial security to be realised across Scotland, but obviously these are kind of applicable more broadly as well. And this draws on the literature on financial well-being, financial inclusion, which some of you may be familiar with, although in kind of classic think tank style, we probably kind of truncated them beyond the kind of complexity of the work that's underpinned them, but hopefully in a way that's kind of useful for policymakers to be articulating where we're trying to get to. So first of all, we're concerned about income being adequate to meet material needs, to provide a decent standard of living, to facilitate full participation in society. Although, and we're concerned about some of the underlying trends that means that incomes aren't adequate across Scotland and across the UK, obviously both in terms of rates of pay and rates of social security benefit payments, but also in terms of hours of work people have access to. Secondly, income needs to be reliable over the medium term. We think that's an increasingly important consideration as we've seen growing income volatility that's been undermining financial security, and that relates both to social security income and to income from work. We think the costs need to be manageable and plannable, and this is particularly when we're talking about basic essentials that need to be covered. And we know that obviously volatility in costs can be what knocks people off course and can undermine financial security, not just in the short term, but over the long term as well. We also think it's really important that people have an expectation that they can make ends meet now and in the future. So in terms of what we're measuring here, this is often relating to subjective measures of financial security, how people feel they're able to manage their finances over the coming months, over that kind of short and medium term horizon. We also think financial resilience is the kind of third really important dimension if we've got income, costs, and then resilience of financial security, and that's relating to access to kind of the shock absorbers or safety nets that we have to fall back on in bad times, in challenges like the one we're all living through at the moment, and that obviously can relate to social security, but also to kind of wider safety net, shock absorbers. Those could be everything from kind of insurance products to access to affordable and reliable credit, financial skills, access to financial tools, so that you can access appropriate advice and financial products. And here, financial inclusion is very explicitly in play. We know that's very closely related to digital inclusion now as well. And then finally, power and control. So this is speaking more to intra-household dynamics. And the ability to have control and autonomy over your personal finances. And obviously, some of you may be familiar with the kind of growing policy interest, as well as the long-standing academic interest in the kind of coercive control dynamics of economic abuse. And we're concerned about building solutions that are cognizant of those dynamics as well, and can respond to them as fully as possible. So why does financial security matter? We think it matters for two really key reasons. The first being that it's financial insecurity is really detrimental to well-being. So this is our kind of first piece of analysis from this report, which is looking at the relationship between symptoms of anxiety and depression and financial insecurity. So if you look at those who are struggling financially, over half of them, half of people who report that they're struggling financially in Scotland are also exhibiting symptoms of anxiety and depression. A similar picture if we look at those behind on bills or those living in poverty after housing costs. And this is analysis, as you say, like most of the analysis I'll present here, of understanding society data. And this is from the kind of the first wave that's in a pre-COVID context. But we know this picture is likely to be worsening still as people are under additional strain from the current situation. But we also know, while we're making these arguments more widely, that financial insecurity is also detrimental to business and the wider economy. So at the kind of firm level, we know that where people are worried about making ends meet, about being able to pay their bills and feed their kids, they're not the most productive workers. We know it has an impact on productivity levels within organisations, and we also know that the economic inequality stems from financial insecurity. We've got somebody. Is also detrimental to the economy.
Be gentle.
Sorry, I'll just come in. I think it's Rose. Rose, can you switch your mic off, please?
I think that's
sorry, Rose.
Thank you, no problem. Just in case we were cutting across each other. So what's the picture of financial security coming into this crisis? So this is the proportion of households in Scotland who are not managing financially and who are really struggling to get by. And you can see this picture here. We've had a kind of spike around the financial crisis, peaking at 2011, 2012. And that from there, we've actually seen quite significant progress in terms of this measure, at least, of financial security over the last decade. But really importantly and concerningly, given the scale of the crisis we're now in, we've seen that progress flatline in the last few years. So we come into this crisis not with a kind of worsening picture, but without one improving one, and quite a difficult baseline of just under 1 in 10 households in Scotland not being able to cope financially, or really struggling to get by week on week. And then obviously we've arrived into the COVID context. With the arrival of the pandemic, we've seen obviously huge amounts of additional strain on households, not just in Scotland, but across the UK and obviously much wider as well. So we've got new challenges to consider across each of those dimensions. So in terms of income, we've seen obviously the loss of hours, then the loss of pay, or people being put on furlough. Obviously really increased threat of redundancy, increased pressure on time, and particularly time for paid work, people with caring responsibilities, and particular workers who've been really exposed, where they haven't been able to access income protections that have been available to other workers in other contexts. On the cost side, we've seen the loss of access to publicly or voluntarily provided services, so particularly in-kind benefits. We've seen obviously quite a public debate around free school meals, although Scotland and Wales being quite far ahead of England on that count. Rising household bills, where people are spending more time at home, having to pay for increased electricity and heating costs, and the increased likelihood of falling into rent arrears, which obviously can see housing costs spiral, where there's really a squeeze on incomes. And then in terms of financial resilience, as was mentioned in the introduction, what we're really concerned about is people kind of drawing down on their savings as they'll need to, but for those savings to be reduced to the point where people are falling into greater amounts of debt, particularly into problem debt, and housing security being a really key concern, particularly in the months ahead. So this is just a quick overview of the kind of government support so far. So we have the kind of policy context. So a very, very short list of what is actually a huge amount of government action at the UK level, spanning universal credit uplifts to action, obviously, on kind of unprecedented government interventions on to protect incomes through the Job Retention Scheme, Self-Employment Income Support Scheme, obviously support to businesses directly through grants and loans, and then action on costs as well through mortgage and loan repayment holidays, and then also eviction bans that we've seen across the UK. For the Scottish Government, we've seen about £4 billion of additional spending in this financial year, that's largely been directed through business support, around 2.2 billion spent on tax holidays for businesses, and direct grants to support businesses through this period. And we've also seen obviously increased public sector spending. And we've also seen action on housing, some of which has been a bit more controversial with the private rented sector landlord loan scheme, which is helping protect landlords against loss of rents that weren't able to come to them where their tenants weren't able to pay or falling into arrears. We've seen an eviction ban that's been extended, which is welcome. And then after considerable pressure from IPPR Scotland and others, we've seen the introduction of a tenant hardship loan fund, which is kind of an access to affordable credit loan routes for tenants that aren't able to make their rent commitments due to the context we're living through. We've seen a temporary uplift to the Scottish carers allowance benefit. That was a one-off additional payment, which was welcome at the time, but obviously a lot of questions about whether that goes far enough, considering how prolonged this crisis is. The additional funding of crisis support, so particularly through the Scottish Welfare Fund, that's managed by local authorities. That's been a very welcome intervention, but there's been a lot of questions around adequacy of the grants that are handed out there, and the kind of mechanisms, particularly as we're seeing families refused, in instances where they're having to self-isolate because, for example, a child, is being advised at school to self-isolate because the kid in the class who's tested positive, but they don't have the kind of positive test that you need to access self-isolation support grants. So some complicating factors there. And then we've seen the provision of free school meals extended, as in Wales, although in slightly different terms, and spending on council tax reductions increase as more people come onto the qualifying benefit universal credit. So where are we now? So we've identified labour market trends through this research that I won't go into in too much detail, that we know are kind of quite challenging headwinds for dealing with this crisis. So the rise of 0 hours contracts, short hours contracts, rising self-employment, obviously not a problem in itself necessarily, but where that's low paid self-employment, or where that comes with increased insecurity and obviously a lack of protection in the event of sickness, then that's more of a challenge. Poor pay growth since the last recession, kind of pattern across the UK, and underemployment rising since the last recession as well. So that's now standing at over 10%, and that's people who want more hours than they're able to work. And that's obviously a particular concern, given that that's now a kind of structural feature of the UK labour market, with so many people using the furlough scheme. So not necessarily bad at the moment, but bad, potentially challenging if we look ahead to the recovery and those hours not being able to be recovered for some time. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, growing income volatility from the labour market, and also from social security, where universal credit payments, the design of universal credit means that additional responsiveness, so being able to kind of change your entitlement based on your earnings from that qualifying period of 30 days, means that for many people in receipt of that benefit, there's less reliability about what income they're going to get from social security payments month on month. And our work with people in receipt of universal credit in Scotland has found that lack of reliability is a real concern, if not the kind of key concern, around financial security. We now know that a V-shaped recovery is unlikely. We're likely to be looking at kind of a period of at least years to recover from this loss of output and employment. But we also have a really rapidly changing context because of new government support that's come in, particularly the extension of the furlough scheme. And we'll be looking at OBR forecasts, which are out later this week when Rishi Sunak stands up to give his kind of latest update on what the policy context will look like, which should give us more of a picture of what particularly the employment forecast looks like in the months ahead. So when we were coming into the crisis, we had 1 in 10 people in Scotland living in a household behind on bills. And if we look at this breakdown across income quintiles in Scotland, we can see that was the experience of a quarter of people living in the poorest income quintile. So financial insecurity is concentrated, perhaps not unsurprisingly, in houses with the lowest incomes, although you can see that that average is still quite concerning across the whole population. And then people who are experiencing insecurity are also found kind of across the wider income spectrum. So this chart shows people who are in poverty, those who are not living under the poverty line but are in the second poorest income quintile, so a risk of being pulled into poverty quite easily without a drastic shock to their incomes. And you can see if you compare to the first bar, that those behind on bills are disproportionately in poverty and in that second income quintile. And the same for those struggling financially, or those who report that they would not be able to cope with an income fall for more than a month. So that's quite a concerning picture in terms of the numbers that we're looking at, and the risk of intensifying poverty in Scotland, but also of people across the income spectrum falling into insecurity, really finding it difficult to make ends meet, were they to lose a portion of their income, as we know has been the case for many people through this crisis so far. So this chart looks at that in a bit more detail. So we know across the income spectrum, a quarter of people would be unable to cope for a month or less if they lost their main source of income. So were they to lose their job, for the most part. And if we look across how that's distributed across income quintiles, we can see that that's again concentrated in those poorest households. And then if we look, we asked people in May, this is from Understanding Society data again, if they were concerned about being able to make their financial commitments over the next 3 months, and around 1 in 5 people were worried at that stage of the pandemic about being able to make those kind of essential commitments. That's household bills, rent, or housing costs. And if we look at what it's meant for financial security so far, we can also see that those who are concerned about job loss or their financial security more broadly are concentrated in those who've been put on furlough. So that risk of that risk to your employment status being a real driver of financial insecurity, at least in terms of how worried you are about losing your job or being able to manage. So getting into what we've seen so far in Scotland in terms of direct financial impacts, we can see that we've seen falling pay across the board. So this is particularly concentrated among self-employed workers. So half of those self-employed workers surveyed in June by the COVID waves of Understanding Society data, which have been coming out more regularly than usual, reported a drop in pay, and that was compared to the start of the year. And that's 34% of employees by comparison had experienced a fall in pay that was reported at some point between May and June. And then this chart looks at kind of persistent pay drop, so those that have seen a pay drop that's continued. And you can see that 12% have seen a pay drop that's persisted for 3 months. So that's quite a concerning picture as well. And then I think one of the really key takeaways from the work we've done so far is just that as self-evident as it might seem, there really is an abundance of evidence that shows that it was those who are already struggling to get by who are hardest hit so far by the financial fallout of this pandemic. So if we're asking the kind of classic political economy questions of who's winning and who's kind of paying for this crisis so far, in terms of household incomes, it's definitely those who are further down the income scale, who were already struggling to make ends meet. Who are seeing the most substantial hits to their incomes. Interestingly, we know that the uplift to universal credit is actually doing quite a lot of work for those who are in poverty, in that kind of direct increase, particularly for those who are in receipt of universal credit but aren't in work. That uplift means that their incomes may actually have increased for a small portion of people. But for those who were on low income, on low incomes and in work, in receipt of universal credit and a little bit further up the income spectrum as well, there's really quite drastic pay drops that are making it very difficult to get by, and obviously that's going to only become more difficult as this situation kind of draws out. Looking in particular at what kind of differently composed families and different groups of people across Scotland and how exposed they are to the impact of COVID so far. We know that lone parent families were most exposed to financial security in terms of household type coming into this crisis. As this chart shows, they're more likely to be across different measures of insecurity, so whether that's poverty, being behind on bills, or struggling to get by financially. Lone parent families are kind of far and away the most exposed to insecurity. But we've actually done some analysis that found that their incomes haven't been hit disproportionately hard. And that's probably because of that universal credit mechanism I just spoke to, where there's kind of less far to fall for those who are already relying on universal credit for the kind of bulk of their incomes. So perhaps not a drastically worsening picture. Although if you look at youth unemployment, something we're particularly concerned about, impact on young people, and we know this is due to a combination of factors, so less time in the labour market, less experience to fall back on. Those who are direct education leavers, obviously competing in really difficult economic conditions, really tough competition for jobs. And then also we know the sectors young people are more likely to work in, particularly hospitality, tourism, are those that are most kind of hardest hit so far. So a combination of where they are in workplaces, who's kind of first to be put on furlough, or first to lose their job if they've been here, if they've been in an organisation for less time than other employees. We know there's particular challenges facing young people, and those are really a really concerning picture. So this is some forecasts that we put together before the extension of the furlough scheme, which is a really important point when we kind of had early doomsday outlook from even the OBR for what unemployment projections might look like come the end of the year. And we thought the youth unemployment could exceed 140,000 young people in Scotland in a worst case scenario. It's now likely that that the extension of the furlough scheme means that there's not that cliff edge of job losses. But whenever that support does wind up, we still have a major policy challenge to kind of see firms through this winter, and to keep employers and their employees on the books coming out the other side of this crisis. We've also identified particular concerns for renters. So if you look across people in different types of tenancies, renters in Scotland are more than 3 times as likely, or 3 times more likely to be struggling with their finances than homeowners. This is perhaps unsurprising, given the kind of financial buffer that's associated with with home ownership. And obviously we know that the composition of home ownership is quite different in different parts of Scotland, as in different parts of Wales, as compared to the rest of the UK. But we know that renters are really disproportionately exposed in this crisis, and that there's a real risk that when we reach the end of eviction bans, we could see a kind of cliff edge of evictions, and really pressures that will push the kind of housing support systems that we have, that sector really over the edge in terms of the capacity it can deliver for housing support for those that need it. So we've called through this work and other work for a kind of arrears relief scheme, particularly in the social housing sector, but also for increased support for renters to get back on their feet where they haven't been able to make their rent over these past few months. So we talked about low-income families, the self-employed, renters, and young people as groups that we know are disproportionately exposed to the impact of the pandemic so far. We also know that parents and carers are really disproportionately exposed. So some research we did back in May as part of this project found that 49% of families with children in Scotland were already struggling to make ends meet, or experiencing more serious financial difficulty. So that's kind of when they're grading themselves, according to their level of security. That's obviously a very concerning picture, and we know that's both in terms of pressure to balance work and caring while care services have been withdrawn. We know that pressure, although it's not as acute perhaps as it was during the first lockdown when all those services were out of reach, we still have these really acute challenges around self-isolation, where school-age children are being sent home from school, where their parents don't have the support to be able to take the time off work, but there's that additional challenge of balancing work, paid work and caring. We know, I should mention as well that obviously we know that the disproportionate share of that work is falling on women, and that the wider kind of labour market impacts of that pressure on women and the longer term impacts are something to give serious thought to now rather than kind of later down the line. We also know that disabled people in Scotland were 37% more likely to be struggling financially coming into this crisis, and research from disabled people's organisations in Scotland, such as Glasgow Disability Alliance, has found there's really substantial additional costs disabled people are experiencing, particularly as social care services have been withdrawn or disrupted, and there's a real risk of deepening financial insecurity for disabled people. And then research we've done that's UK-wide, but using the same Understanding Society data, has found that ethnic minority workers are disproportionately exposed to job losses as compared to all workers across the UK. So some really serious concerns about kind of widening a lot of the structural inequalities we see across the UK labour market and across Scotland's labour market along lines of gender, disability and ethnicity. So some key takeaways from this research so far are that the pandemic has exposed the weaknesses of our social safety net, that levels of financial risk borne by many in Scotland were too high. There should be another O on that too. Too high to sustain, and this crisis has obviously been, kind of the ultimate test of financial security, or the test of how far insecurity can stretch. And with the erosion of households' financial buffers, there's really, really drastic impacts that we'll likely see over the coming months. And that's if support isn't extended, if there aren't kind of wider economic efforts to shore up jobs and to kind of keep families afloat through the social security system. We know that financial security is rising amongst those who are already struggling. So in income terms and also in terms of those demographic exposures I've spoken to. So I think a really key takeaway for us is that, as many people have observed, although we might be in the same storm, weathering the same storm, we're not all in the same boat. And this is a really, really important kind of challenge for policy design going forward as well. That there are particular barriers to financial security and to rebuilding that financial security in the context of the pandemic. And we're also going to need to see substantial policy action to boost incomes, to protect against rising costs, and to strengthen the social safety net that's available to families over this winter. We've made particular calls around families with children who were concerned, have additional risks of falling out of the labour market, falling into poverty. And that could obviously in the Scottish context, threatens to roll back progress that has been made towards reducing child poverty in Scotland, particularly with the kind of concentration of political will around those 2030 child poverty targets. And we also have argued that this needs to be delivered through a substantial fiscal stimulus, and that will obviously depend on action from UK governments as well as governments in Scotland and Wales. And then just very quickly to run through some of the policy recommendations we've made, and I won't talk about them in detail, they're there in a report for anyone who's interested in that side of things. They kind of fit into a few different camps. The first is better data. So we know that a lot of the data that analysts are relying on to kind of grapple with the situation, to understand how things are changing, is coming either from the COVID Understanding Society data, ways that we've seen, although we've got limited sample sizes for Scotland as well as for Wales and Northern Ireland, which can present challenges when you're doing more complicated demographic analysis. There's serious restrictions there. But sources like the Standard Life Foundation, who funded this research, they fund a financial impact tracker that's been used very widely and has been relied upon, where that data isn't provided by kind of government sources. Data that provides that level of detail. It's kind of a wide, large sample, regular YouGov survey that's going out across the UK. We've also made income side recommendations that span strengthening social security, so for everything from keeping the uplift to universal credit, to uprating Scottish benefits through the months ahead, to expanding and accelerating the rollout of the Scottish child payment that's coming in Scotland, and obviously around jobs as the kind of key fear here. And supporting people into good quality work. So that's particularly around interventions like the Kickstart scheme, and the supporting job guarantee that's offered in Scotland for young people who are at risk of falling into falling out of the labour market altogether, falling out of education, employment or training. And then cost side recommendations that span those the acute housing cost challenges that I've spoken to a little bit, and also span food security that we know is a growing challenge in Scotland, as across the UK. And then finally, they span the kind of financial resilience safety net angle as well. So looking at access to affordable credit, where those kind of income side interventions have failed or fallen short, routes to boost savings where that's conceivable, where families are getting back on their feet, and then crisis funds, looking at how those are managed and how they're accessed across Scotland. So I think I'll leave it there, and we can hopefully have some questions. We've covered quite a lot of ground. But thanks very much for listening along.
Brilliant. That really was a really clear presentation, Rachel, with lots to digest there. And Sally's already clapping. So we're open for questions. So if you want to ask a question, please put your hand up or write something in the chat. And while you're all thinking, I'll take Chair's action and ask, maybe I'd quite like to ask two, really, because I was particularly interested in, well, loads of stuff, but in the policy suggestions, recommendations at the end. So there's one on universal basic income and what your thoughts on that, and whether if we had a UBI in place, whether we might have been able to avoid particularly some of the shocks to low income households. And the second one is on, you had a little point on at the end about boost to savings. So we know, I mean, with people's buffers being eroded or just eaten up entirely, it's going to take quite a while for anybody in those circumstances to build up any kind of savings. And I just wondered whether there's a role for Scottish Government, national, as well as devolved governments, to think about matching any kind of savings, as is already being done in terms of people saving to buy a house, young people. So yeah, those two were mine, and then I'll hopefully there'll be some questions from other people.
Great, thanks very much. So I should have said that this kind of the second stage of this work is looking at exactly what you've kind of just brought us into quite neatly, the kind of bigger picture policy solutions. So I didn't go into the detail of the ones that were put forward in this report because they were quite, they're kind of quite specific to the Scottish context for the most part, and some of them are kind of fairly technical. But we're now kind of setting our sights on a report that will come out at the start of next year that's looking at those kind of broader, kind of more fundamental questions about how you respond to, to these levels of financial insecurity that, that we're seeing as, kind of feature of the Scottish landscape and across the UK as well. One thing we are considering, and it's a slight twist on a UBI, is a minimum income guarantee. And so that's, we did a piece of work back in 2018, looking at interventions that could reduce child poverty in Scotland. And we found that a minimum income guarantee, so that's targeting setting kind of minimum income standard. I'm sure you're familiar, but just in case anyone isn't, a minimum income standard for different families, and that could be set at slightly different rates compared to number of dependent children in a household. Things like disability costs or childcare costs are also considered. So recognizing that people aren't starting from a kind of an equal starting point. It's not a kind of straight race. We think that's potentially a really transformative kind of vision to be working towards in Scotland. And there is obviously in the Scottish context, particularly at the moment, with the feasibility studies into universal basic income that we actually worked on some of the economic modelling for. That's quite a live debate, kind of UBI or alternatives. And there's some kind of pilots that are being worked through, at least in terms of the technical feasibility of them. But one thing that is a concern of mine personally is that is the kind of cost associated with a kind of blunt universalist mechanism. If the point of a UBI is to kind of reduce child poverty particularly. So our modelling suggested that the cost associated with reducing child poverty in Scotland for kind of every child lifted out of poverty through a UBI mechanism would be drastically more than if it was a more targeted mechanism like a minimum income standard, and we've kind of compared those. So that's kind of where our thinking is going at the moment. But that's, I think, fundamentally it's trying to respond to a lot of the same challenges, which is, how can we have a kind of a basic, level of income that people can have a decent standard of living from. I think that really is the kind of place that hopefully there'll be more space opened up for in terms of social policy debate in months ahead, and hopefully there are kind of routes for devolved governments to making steps towards those ambitions at least. And that's what we're going to be looking at, kind of laying a path for. And then in terms of savings, I think it's a really intrinsic challenge, isn't it? So I think that the idea of government matching is definitely something that needs to be considered in terms of wider response. There's I think the question at the moment is often one of timing. in that, whilst we don't know when we're going to kind of be heading out of the woods, when those sorts of interventions might be effective, is kind of half the challenge. We've looked at, we've done some kind of early thinking on kind of matching social security payments, so whether the kind of double payment and one is kind of in a kind of protected savings account, something like that. But obviously that really depends on a commitment to to increase the adequacy of those payments to begin with, because that's obviously the kind of fundamental problem we have at the moment. There's no point saying we're going to put half your payment that isn't enough to make ends meet for your family in a protected savings account right now. We're going to have to draw down on it in the kind of coming weeks, let alone months. So yeah, definitely worth some further thought there as well.
Thanks, Rachel. That's really interesting responses there. Thank you. We've got a question from Chris. Chris.
Hi, thanks, Rachel. I really enjoyed that. I think my question was probably covered a little bit by what Ian asked about the UBIs and the savings. It was a kind of ask a question about the social safety net and the weaknesses of the current system. And I wondered if you might say a bit more about what we might learn from this in terms of what the weaknesses of the current system are. I mean, unless, of course, your kind of conclusion is that the minimum income guarantee is the ultimate kind of resolution to those weaknesses, whether you think there are particular weaknesses in the social security system that have been exposed through this crisis, and what particular things should we be drawing attention to, really?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's quite a lot to say there. I suppose some of the, I think fundamentally we've seen the kind of inadequacy of payments in terms of generosity being really kind of put up in lights as more people have fallen back on the universal universal credit on the safety nets we have available to us. I think weaknesses that we're particularly concerned about are around that reliability question. If we're talking about financial security, and if we're talking about getting to a place where where families could conceivably really quite some time probably down the line from where we are now start to be looking at saving, and we've heard it really directly through work we've done with people in receipt of universal credit around the very obvious questions of how do you afford a child's birthday, new school shoes, all the costs that families routinely have to handle, that an inadequate an unreliable social safety net can make all the more difficult. So that is, I think, a kind of intrinsic technical question, because there's you can choose to have a payment system that is very responsive to changes in income, month on month. There were strong arguments for that. I think the way it's been, designed and delivered, clearly isn't actually, it isn't kind of meeting the objectives that it was set out to meet in that regard. So I think that's a kind of knotty question for social policy thinkers to be dealing with. And then we've also seen the kind of the gaps. One really obvious one in the Scottish context is no recourse to public funds. Increasing pressure there around people who aren't able to access the social safety net others are able to fall back on, and how those costs are then transferred onto local authorities a lot of the time. Those aren't people in crisis are going to need support from somewhere, and some really fundamental questions about who and what our social safety net is for, that have been kind of thrown up here.
Can I just follow that up? I mean, the point about reliability of income seems really important. So I just want to throw something back at you. I mean, that's something about the way in which benefit systems are communicated and understood by the users of those benefits. And of course, the point about something like this is that most people were not users of those benefits, so that they were new users. I wonder whether a minimum income guarantee is the right thing to kind of address that issue of reliability versus a universal basic income, where it would be very easily understood, versus something which is, it depends on your circumstances, and then you've got to understand all those processes. And I wonder how you're going to argue that one still outweighs the other, despite your earlier point, which is about reliability being a kind of key factor. Yeah,
no, I think it's a really good point. I think it's trying to toss up those. So our primary concern around universal basic income at the levels we've modelled it at, within the fiscal constraints of the current, Scotland's current fiscal framework particularly, is that toss up of reliability versus adequacy. And that's really well kind of brought together in your point there. And those are really difficult challenges. I think basically, given my assessment of the kind of current situation is where we're at now, there is so much work to be done to lift incomes to a standard that is adequate for a decent standard of living, for participation in society. Those really really basic fundamental goals that we can need our social safety net to still be targeted to be able to do that heavy lifting effectively. We're also interested in things like universal basic services, which could cover some of the kind of basic costs measures. So I suppose that's how we're thinking about the kind of reliability questions, so how we can tackle those basic costs that we know are kind of pulling families under at the moment, and how how we can look at what public policy interventions can do to better meet those costs for families.
Thanks, Rachel. Now we have two questions. So I've got one in the chat from Erin, and I'll ask that, and then I'll hand over to Sally for her question. So the first one from Erin is, how have you separated COVID-based impacts on financial security from Brexit-based impacts?
Oh, that's a really good question. Not particularly deliberately, I guess. I think that's gonna be more of a question or more of a challenge going forward. I guess that kind of brings us to some fundamental questions about how you ever attribute, changing, a kind of changing picture in terms of household incomes, particularly at the kind of aggregate level, to really drastically changing economic circumstances. I know, from our experience, we found that relying on the kind of baseline scenarios put forward by the OBR and others, like the Bank of England, has been really important for kind of basing our wider work. But we're in, I think, when you're in such drastically and rapidly changing kind of economic circumstances, the strength of your assumptions matters all the more. And we're kind of working at the moment to kind of build in Brexit assumptions in our forward-looking work. But in this work, we've just been looking directly at what's happened to people's incomes over the last few months. And yeah, that's definitely a question to be grappling with in our work looking over the next parliamentary term.
Thanks, Rachel. Sally and then Sinead. Sally? You're still on mute.
Internet connections.
Oh, I don't think we can quite hear you.
Yeah. Sally, I think you're on mute. Hang on, I think Sally's disappeared. Can we go to Sinead, and then if Sally comes back, we can. Sinead, do you have a question?
Oh, poor Sally.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rachel. I really enjoyed that. I'll read the report as well with interest. And you covered a lot, but I just wanted to pick up on the youth unemployment slide, and just a bit of a specific question that I totally understand if you can't answer, if you can't answer it at the moment. But one of the big issues with the UK's Kickstart scheme to get young people to sort of mitigate the youth unemployment crisis that we're seeing at the moment is the fact that it's only for 6 months, which is very short term, and that it's based on receipt of universal credit. And we know that the numbers of young people who are eligible for universal credit and also claiming it are dropping, partly because of the gig economy, as you talked about, and precarity. So I wondered, the Scottish Recovery Plan, Protecting Scotland, Renewing Scotland, did say that there was a will to kind of enhance and improve Kickstart and to work with it in that way. But I wondered if you had any more of a sense about whether those two particular issues were kind of on the radar or going to be addressed in any way. And as I say, it's not really something you covered in your presentation, so I get if it's kind of outside the remit of the project, but I thought I'd ask just in case.
Yeah, no, not at all. That's a really good question. So I think what we have seen in Scotland is a youth guarantee scheme that's kind of wraps around the Kickstarter scheme, as you mentioned. And some of our key concerns in the design of that scheme have been around exactly that, kind of the 6-month cliff edge. I think that's even more of a concern now, and hopefully a kind of growing, a more broadly held concern now that obviously this crisis is, is going to continue for more than, the kind of that 6-month horizon that was originally envisaged, that needed to be kind of bridged. So I think I know that we've been pushing particularly for it to be linked not just to employment opportunities, but also to kind of high quality training opportunities, pushing for things like the apprenticeship commitments in Scotland to be maintained, so those opportunities aren't lost where we're in a different kind of business environment where employers are more hesitant perhaps about taking on apprentices. And we're doing some work now that's kind of looking towards the kind of college sector in Scotland, and it's looking kind of more broadly across the kind of skills piece in Scotland, so 2 different pieces of work at how things like individual learning accounts being built into that job guarantee, that youth guarantee offer might give young people an opportunity to both have access to a kind of a continued learning training opportunity that has a kind of career progression plan built into it, rather than just being a kind of 6-month placement that then is going to end and not necessarily end up in a job, or kind of progress through a formal education route. So we don't have kind of hard answers in terms of where Scottish Government's thinking at the moment, but we probably will be kind of looking more closely at exactly those questions in coming months.
Sorry, thank you. Is that the Developing the Young Workforce scheme, the training?
It's linked to it. I can send you a piece that I wrote directly on the on how they're slightly mashed together, but that was a couple of months ago, so I'm not sure exactly how it's progressed since that point.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll email you afterwards. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Okay, I think unfortunately we've lost Sally, which but I'm sure Sally will be able to get in touch with Rachel outside the meeting. I think there are kind of black holes in Cardiff sometimes when it comes to the internet. I know I'm in one. I'd just like to say thank you so much to Rachel for presenting the seminar today. There was lots of important stuff there that has real relevance for what is happening in Wales as much as in Scotland, and we'd be delighted to have you back again at some certain point, maybe to look at the impact of Brexit. What be as bad as some of the forecasts are saying at the moment. But diolch yn fawr iawn, Rachel, that was fantastic, and thanks to everyone for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Brilliant.
Thanks.